And let's look at one of the context of this tit for tat part here too. If the intent from the United States side is to coerce Iran into submission to who knows what, because it's not enumerated, but it's apparently trying to force them into doing something here. That seems to have gotten more complicated because of the supreme leader's funeral procession, because it was tremendously popular among the people in both Iran and Iraq, as millions came to each of these locations. And then there was, we see this here, that there has been a tremendous desire for revenge against Trump for assassinating their supreme leader. Now, we hopefully we'll have later on this afternoon, if we can get the signal to work, Suleiman Ahmed, who is a Western journalist based out of UK, was, as far as we know, the only Western journalist that was allowed to go with all of the stops throughout this whole procession, all the way through to the final resting place. And he said he was interviewing people at each of the locations. And he said one thing that really stood out to him was the two different things. One was the, as you see there, from this hatred of President Trump for what he did, because they now recognize and now view the supreme leader, who was a divisive figure among many in Iran, now is almost being synonymous with the nation of Iran, with their culture. Ergo, they did that to us, to me, is how he said they were. So there's a lot of anger on that. That has another ramification that you might not, or that some might not have thought about, is that now there's pressure from the people on the government not to have any kind of a compromise with the West. They were apparently unhappy that they signed the MOU in the first place. And the thing that really stood out to me, and I'd like your view on this, is that the Suleiman told me that the thing that surprised him the most was in the first stop in Tehran, when President Pezeshkian came out to say something, he got booed by the Iranian people, because he was too much on the let's have a deal with the American side, and they don't want to deal with the American side. What do you make of that?
Well, the same thing happened to Arachi, the foreign minister, and they had to pull both of them out before they were physically attacked. As we know full well, Danny, there were lots of people inside of Iran, and some of them were very powerful people, who were unhappy with the memorandum of understanding. They thought that Iran should have played hardball and not agreed to sign it. Iran actually had a lot more leverage than the Iranian negotiators understood, and they were foolish to sign that agreement. And furthermore, you can't trust the United States anyway. And if you look at what's happened, Danny, I think the hardliners have been proved correct. I mean, I think this is the problem that people like Arachi and Ghalibaf and others face. They thought that the negotiations would be fruitful, and that has not happened at all. You want to remember here that there are sort of three big problems from the Iranian point of view in terms of the West living up to the memorandum of understanding. What we have been talking about now is the whole question of control of the Strait of Hormuz. And the issue here is that the United States thinks that some tankers or some ships can go through the Omani Channel in the Strait. And the Iranians say that is absolutely unacceptable. And this is what the two tit for tats have been all about, the two tit for tats that have taken place since the memorandum of understanding was signed. It's all about the question of whether or not ships can go through the Omani Channel. That's the issue. That's one big issue regarding the MOU. There are two other issues as well. One of them is that the United States has now said that it is not going to allow Iran to sell oil in world markets. And that was part of the memorandum of understanding. And you remember, as soon as the memorandum was signed, the Iranians were allowed, without penalty, to sell oil in world markets. The United States has now reneged on that element of the agreement. Furthermore, in the memorandum of understanding, this was the very first point, it was made clear that the Israelis had to cease and desist from their war against Hezbollah. And that, of course, meant getting out of southern Lebanon. And not only have the Israelis not gotten out of southern Lebanon, but they've continued their war against Hezbollah. So when you look at what's happening from an Iranian point of view, there are actually three elements in the memorandum of understanding where the Iranians believe that the United States has not lived up to its part of the bargain. And given that, coupled with the horrendous things that President Trump says about the Iranian leaders and the Iranian people, and given the fact that he's threatened to wipe them off the face of the earth, it's hard to see how you're going to get any cooperation in the near future from the Iranians that works to America's advantage. They have a powerful incentive to play hardball with us.
Let's see. That is today. Looks like I had not seen that one. So that's President Trump. The Islamic Republic of Iran has asked us to continue talks. We have agreed to do so. Very, very kind of President Trump. But the United States has stated to them in no uncertain terms that the ceasefire is over. Thank you for your attention to this matter. That is 1 hour ago. So that less than an hour ago that President Trump just said that. So we'll see how that's going to play into those hardliners that you're literally talking about right now. That's as we're basically speaking. Trump reinforces that the ceasefire is over, which may imply there's another tit for tat coming or another strike coming. What do you make of that?
Well, what good is it going to do? I mean, again, there is no theory of victory here. Nobody can explain how this has an ending that works to our advantage. We signed the memorandum of understanding on June 17th because it was the best deal we could get. Yes, it was basically a surrender document, but that's because we lost the war. We have no military option here. Doing more tit for tat doesn't solve anything. And furthermore, this is, I think, a very important part of the story, Danny, because the Iranians have been consumed with the funeral. They have not really said much about how they are going to respond to what President Trump has just done. In other words, I said before, the war in southern Lebanon has not ended. The Israelis have not pulled out. The Iranians are no longer able to sell oil on world markets. And the United States continues to insist that ships can go through the Omani Channel. Okay? So if you're the Iranians, what do you do when you hear that? They're not going to cave. We know that. They're going to play hardball. Are they going to really limit how much comes out of the Gulf? Are they going to shut the Gulf down altogether? Are they going to mine the Omani Channel? What exactly are they going to do? It's very hard to say. And then what are we going to do in response? I don't think President Trump wants a situation where the Gulf gets shut down again, or the number of ships coming out is reduced to single digits. That is not in America's interest at this point in time. It's certainly not in President Trump's political interest. But I'm not sure what he's thinking, because it's just very hard to understand what the administration is doing here. And furthermore, just one final point on this point by Trump that the Iranians have asked him to go back to negotiations and that he's kindly agreed to do that is ludicrous. Right? There's no evidence of that. If anything, the Iranians are hinting, and I underline the word hinting, that they're not interested in going back to negotiations at the time. And it looks like the Pakistanis and the Omanis are working overtime to change their mind on that. But the idea that they called up President Trump and said, please, let's go back to negotiations is kind of a laughable argument.
Yeah, it would be laughable if the stakes weren't so much, because he said that literally the other day too, that they are begging me for a negotiator. And then obviously that was even during the ceremony when the Supreme Leader was being laid to rest in his final place. And I think it's pretty ridiculous to suggest that they did. Want to look at, you mentioned that there was some additional headwinds. You mentioned one about Lebanon. I think that there's an additional one I want to talk about on top of that. But since you brought it up, let's look at Lebanon, because this is from the Jerusalem Post this morning. This was in an op-ed. First of all, it says withdrawal cannot be a gesture of faith. U.S. Israel must align on Lebanon, meaning that they must pull us to their side. But then you see that subhead there. That's not an opinion piece. That's what the Israeli Defense Minister, Israel Katz, said. We did not ask anyone's permission to enter Lebanon, and we do not need anyone's permission to stay in Lebanon. Does that sound like that President Trump is in charge and that he's going to demand that they leave because that's what he signed in the MOU? How do you see that?
Well, if the Iranians insist that they will not negotiate until the Israelis are out of southern Lebanon, the question is, what does President Trump do at that point in time? Let's assume, and we're just assuming here because we don't know exactly what the Iranians are going to do, but let's assume that the Iranians effectively shut down the strait, that the number of ships going out is very small on a daily basis. And at the same time, they say they will not go back to negotiations. There'll be no negotiations until the Israelis are out of southern Lebanon. Then the question is, what is President Trump going to do? Is he just going to say, okay, the status quo is fine and we'll just continue like this? I don't think so. I don't think he can do that. And I think he will go to great lengths to put pressure on the Israelis to get out. Now, whether he succeeds at that remains to be seen. But if he doesn't succeed, the question is, where does that leave the United States? And it leaves us in deep trouble.
And well, it leaves us in deep trouble is the best way to put that. We have a quote here a minute ago. I'm not sure if he's scrambling to try to find it behind the scenes. I threw a curveball at him because Professor Morandi, who certainly you know well, has addressed that very issue right there. If we can find it, I'm going to pull it up in just a second here. But in the meantime, let me go up to what I said is the second issue here, and that is the issue with additional problems. And I'm looking at the wrong thing. Things got moved. There we go. That is Turkey. This is again from today's Jerusalem Post. As Iran fades, Turkey emerges as Israel's biggest strategic threat, a NATO ally, and they're, of course, upset right now because of the F-35s, but that's hardly the biggest issue. What can you tell us about this growing conflict, and do you have concerns that it may literally supplant the Iranian problem for Israel?
Well, it's, in my opinion, hard to believe that the Israelis are now picking a fight with the Turks. You would think that they have their hands full in Gaza, on the West Bank, in Syria, and in Lebanon, not to mention Iran. In my opinion, they've suffered the Israelis have suffered a humiliating defeat in Iran. And you want to remember here, Danny, that the most important issue from the Israeli point of view has always been Iran's nuclear capability. And if we don't get negotiations going, we're never going to get a nuclear deal, a new version of the JCPOA. And who knows what the Iranians will do on the nuclear front. So the Israelis have lost in Iran in a really serious way. And as we were just talking about earlier in the show, there's no way to rescue the situation, right? The best that you can hope for is a revised JCPOA. But it's not clear you're even going to get that at this point in time, given where we're going. So again, Iran, Gaza, the West Bank, Syria, Lebanon, and here they are putting their gun sights on Turkey and alienating the Turks. And furthermore, this has consequences for the U.S.-Israeli relationship. I mean, the U.S.-Israeli relationship in the sense that President Trump was just in Istanbul, making it very clear that the principal reason he was there was because of Erdogan, who he considers a good friend. And he talked about giving the Turks F-35s. So what Trump is trying to do is improve relations with Turkey. And at the same time, Netanyahu's picking a fight with Turkey, which is going to put Trump in a terribly awkward position. And the question is, if you're Donald Trump, do you need that? And the answer is no. The Israelis won't cooperate on southern Lebanon. They won't cooperate on Gaza. They won't cooperate on the West Bank. They won't cooperate on Iran, and so forth and so on. And now you're picking a fight with Turkey, which is going to complicate Trump's diplomacy with Turkey. This is not good from Israel's point of view, but it's where Israel is at this point in time.
Well, and let me show you. Let me complicate things a little bit more, or rather, illuminate the complications a little bit more, because this whole issue of primarily U.S., Israel, Iran, and the nuclear issue, and you have to include Lebanon in that, which you just did a second ago. All of those things are just a Gordian knot that it's just nearly impossible to undo. Let me show you how it's even more difficult than some may think. is that you said the issue with Lebanon is one of the primary issues. Well, here's how it is the Iranian studies view it. This is Professor Morandi here just a few days ago explaining how important Lebanon is to even getting what President Trump wants. His whole thing has always been it's the nuclear deal. They can't have nuclear weapons. That's his mantra, his objective here. Here's how complicated it is now.
The Iranians have told the Omani government that they would like to work with them. They've had negotiations. But the Iranians have also said if Oman pulls back under duress from the United States, Iran will do it alone. So Iran is not going to wait for Oman. The decision has been made in Iran that they will, from now on, control the strait. They will take fees. The Iranians have been very clear to the Americans. There will be no nuclear deal if Lebanon is evacuated, if it is not evacuated, if the war does not end. There will be no nuclear negotiations if this does not take place. So that's really up to the Americans. And in addition to that, the Iranians can make life for the Americans much more difficult in the Strait of Hormuz. If the Americans refrain from carrying out their obligations elsewhere, then the Iranians will feel that they are not obliged to allow all that many ships to pass through.
So there it is. And that's the leverage that you talked about there at the end, but also the situation that, hey, we won't even talk to you about what you want, Mr. President, unless this issue with Lebanon gets done. Do you think that that's just bluster on the Iranian side?
I don't think it's just bluster. And there's all sorts of evidence that the Iranians have said that on the internet, but I've not seen it in the Western press. And as you know, Danny, one of the big problems that we face is evaluating what's true and what's not true. And when you see reports that the Iranians have said what Professor Morandi said is their position, you're never completely sure whether it's true or not. My sense is that it is true, that the Iranians have reached a point where they will not cut a deal on the nuclear issue. In fact, I think the Iranians will not continue to negotiate, period, until the Israelis are out of southern Lebanon. And there has to be some sort of agreement also, just to go back to the clip you played, on the whole question of the Omani Channel in the Gulf. I actually thought it was basically solved after the last tit for tat, not the one that just took place, the one that took place between June 26th and June 28th. I thought after that one was over with, we understood that the memorandum of understanding made it clear that Iraq controls the strait and we can't send ships. That Iran, controls the strait and we can't send ships through.
That's what we signed.
That's what we signed. Yeah. If you look at Article 5, it seems clear to me that that's what we signed. And after the previous tit for tat, this is the June 26th to June 28th one, which was over this issue. It looked like once that tit for tat stopped that we had resolved this issue. But then it started again because we sent more ships to the Omani Channel. And they, of course, attacked the ships. And then we started the tit for tat. So you say to yourself, where are we now? Are we going to, in a week's time, send more ships or encourage more ships to go through the Omani Channel? And then we're back to square one.